Was one of those bright Saturday mornings when the suburban neighborhood still carried the quiet hum of sprinklers and the occasional bark of dogs behind trimmed hedges. The lawns stretched green and uniform, just the way the homeowners association insisted they should. Everything was neat, controlled, and picture-perfect, until my truck rolled slowly down the cul-de-sac, towing behind it a gleaming 30-foot fishing boat. Its polished hull shimmered in the sun, its chrome rails reflecting streaks of light that caught the attention of more than a few curious neighbors. The neighborhood was the kind of place where even slightly uneven hedges could spark gossip. So, it was no surprise when curtains fluttered and blinds tilted just as I began reversing the boat into my driveway. The HOA president, though everyone just called her Karen behind her back, wasn't far behind. She was notorious for her hawk-like watch over the community. If a trash bin lingered on the curb 10 minutes too long, she knew. If grass crept past the regulation length, she had a note ready. And now, her eyes had locked onto my boat as though it were a personal insult carved into fiberglass. From across the street, she appeared in her crisp cardigan and oversized sunglasses, clutching a phone like it was an extension of her authority. She didn't march, she stormed. Every step radiated disapproval, every motion a warning. The whispers of neighbors already outside seemed to follow her like an invisible entourage. Some shook their heads, already bracing for drama, while others leaned forward with interest. They knew the storm was about to break. As I adjusted the trailer, I could feel her glare piercing into my back. It didn't take long before the shrill sound of her voice carried across the cul-de-sac. Though I couldn't make out every word, I didn't need to. Her finger pointed, her hands flailed, and her face turned the shade of overripe tomatoes. She was furious, not just because there was a boat in the neighborhood, but because it was mine, and she had never liked the way I ignored her petty rules with a polite smile. But instead of confronting me directly, Karen did what she always threatened to do. She called. The screen of her phone glowed as she spoke rapidly into it, pacing the edge of her lawn like a general plotting strategy. It wasn't a friendly call to the HOA board. It was 911. She was reporting me as though I had just hauled in contraband instead of parking a weekend fishing vessel. I stayed calm, unhooking straps and preparing to secure the boat, while neighbors exchanged looks of disbelief. A few shook their heads, whispering that Karen had gone too far this time. Yet, others watched with anticipation, eager to see how far she was willing to push. And push she did. It wasn't long before the distant wail of sirens grew louder, winding through the neighborhood's tidy streets. Red and blue lights flickered against the perfectly painted facades of the houses as a patrol car rolled up. The officer stepped out with a practiced calm, scanning the scene. Karen rushed forward like a prosecuting attorney, her words pouring out in a torrent of accusations. She pointed, gestured, and painted me as some sort of neighborhood menace. The officer listened politely, jotting down notes, though the skepticism on his face was difficult to miss. The neighbors had formed a small gathering by then. Some stood with arms crossed, others whispered into phones, no doubt texting updates to friends. The tension was thick, the kind that made silence feel louder than noise. When the officer finally approached me, his tone was steady, his questions straightforward. Why was the boat here? Did I know about the HOA rules? Was I aware that certain associations restricted large vehicles and trailers? I answered with patience, never raising my voice, never breaking composure. What Karen and the watching neighbors didn't know was that my calm wasn't born of ignorance. It was born of certainty. Because the boat wasn't just a toy. It wasn't just a weekend fishing vessel that I had nowhere else to keep. It was docked elsewhere most of the time, at a place I knew very well. A place that would change the entire balance of power between me and Karen. I owned more than just this boat. I owned the whole marina. And as the officer looked from Karen's frantic gestures to my steady stance, I knew the real story was only beginning. The officer's presence did little to cool the heat simmering in the cul-de-sac. If anything, it seemed to stoke the fire. Karen thrived on attention, and now that a patrol car was parked at the curb with its lights still flashing, she had an audience. She spoke animatedly, her arms slicing the air as though she were cutting through invisible walls of resistance. She pointed at the boat, at the trailer, even at the officer himself when she felt her words weren't carrying enough weight. Neighbors lingered longer at their windows. Some had stepped onto porches with arms folded, shaking their heads or filming quietly with their phones. The cul-de-sac had transformed into a stage, and Karen believed herself to be the star. She believed she was performing a civic duty, standing up for the sanctity of rules and order. The officer, however, was unmoved. He studied the boat, the truck, and finally the papers I provided. My calm demeanor contrasted sharply with Karen's fiery tirade. She mistook his silence for agreement, pushing harder with every accusation, certain that justice, her definition of it, was about to be served. But cracks were beginning to show. The officer shifted his weight, his expression flattening into professional patience. He asked more questions, less about violations and more about specifics, where I kept the boat, whether it was stored legally, and what arrangements I had outside the neighborhood. I answered plainly, letting the documents in my hands do most of the talking. Titles, registrations, ownership records. Every detail was legitimate. Karen faltered for only a moment before recovering, latching onto the one thing she believed could not be argued: the HOA rules. She insisted that the association had strict regulations, that no boats or trailers were permitted overnight, that what I had done was not just inconvenient but a clear violation. She demanded action, demanded consequences. The officer nodded slowly, but his eyes carried a weight she didn't catch. He wasn't a neighbor, wasn't invested in the neighborhood's politics. His concern wasn't whether the lawns matched or whether a boat spoiled the view. His only concern was whether laws had been broken. And by the look on his face, he found none. The crowd, however, was split. A few of Karen's loyal supporters nodded along with her, eager to see the officer drag the boat away or slap me with a fine. But others murmured their disagreement, shaking their heads at her theatrics. The spectacle had gone too far, and the call to 911 was a step many thought reckless. The HOA was one thing. The police were another. Still, Karen pressed. She wanted a resolution that would validate her authority, something that would make an example of me. She demanded the officer enforce the HOA's will, as though his badge were a tool of neighborhood convenience. Instead, the officer turned his attention back to me, asking about my storage arrangements. I explained that the boat had a proper home, one that wasn't the driveway. I explained how it was usually docked at a marina, maintained and secured there. What Karen and most of the neighbors didn't know was the critical detail that underpinned it all. The marina wasn't just where I kept my boat. It was mine. The officer raised an eyebrow as the documents revealed more than just ownership of the boat itself. They revealed titles linked to a sprawling marina complex just outside town, complete with slips, storage, and all the amenities that local boaters relied on. My name wasn't just on a registration, it was on deeds, contracts, and business licenses. The implication began to ripple outward. Neighbors who had been whispering now stared openly. Some recognized the marina's name instantly, realizing they had rented slips there themselves or knew someone who had. The realization settled in like a wave, and even the officer's posture shifted slightly, the faintest hint of acknowledgement passing across his face. Karen, however, refused to yield. She scoffed, brushed off the documents, and doubled down. In her mind, none of it mattered. She didn't care who owned what or how legitimate my claims were. All that mattered was her interpretation of the rules. She demanded that the officer force me to move the boat immediately, to issue penalties, to validate her authority. The officer did not comply. His duty was not to enforce the whims of a homeowners association. He explained calmly that unless there was a law being broken, there was little he could do. Karen's face twisted with outrage, her authority slipping through her fingers even as she tried to clutch it tighter. But she wasn't done. If she couldn't win through the officer, she would take the fight directly to the HOA board. She stormed away, her phone already in hand again, this time dialing fellow board members to rally them against me. And as she disappeared into her house, her blinds snapping shut with finality. The crowd dispersed slowly. Some left with smirks, others with quiet amusement, and a few with genuine curiosity about what would happen next. The officer gave me a final nod before returning to his car, the flashing lights fading into silence as he drove away. The cul-de-sac returned to its usual calm, but the storm hadn't ended. It had only shifted. Karen was regrouping, preparing for a new offensive, one that would reach beyond a single phone call. And this time, she would try to bring the entire HOA against me. In the end, Karen's relentless battle with rules backfired. The HOA board, swayed by my proof of owning the marina and the community's growing frustration with her antics, voted to censure her. Neighbors realized her authority had limits, and the spectacle she created only exposed her pettiness. My boat returned to the marina, my reputation untarnished, and Karen's power crumbled. What began as a call to 911 ended as her downfall.